The bitter December wind cut through Aria's thin coat as she rushed through the revolving doors of Valentino's, Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurant. Her fingers were numb, her dark hair falling in damp strands around her face from the unexpected snow shower that had caught her on her 3-block sprint from the subway. "You're late again," hissed Paolo, the floor manager, his usually composed face tight with panic as he intercepted her near the kitchen entrance. "Table 9, VIP section. You're serving tonight instead of Beatrice, who called in sick with that stomach bug going around." "But that's not my section," Aria protested, fumbling with her apron ties while trying to smooth down her wrinkled uniform. At 19, with mounting student loans and an overdue rent notice taped to her door that morning, she couldn't afford to lose this job that barely covered her expenses. Paolo gripped her shoulders firmly, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that sent chills down her spine. "Listen carefully, Aria. These people are important. Very important. Don't make mistakes, don't stare, and whatever happens, be invisible. Do you understand me?" The main dining room gleamed with warm lighting, crystal glasses capturing the glow from ornate chandeliers against pristine white tablecloths that contrasted with the dark mahogany floors. Aria moved through the space with practiced grace, spine straight, despite her racing heart and the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. She paused at the heavy oak door leading to the private dining area, took a steadying breath that did little to calm her nerves, and entered with a gentle knock that seemed to echo in her ears. 6 men in custom suits that cost more than her semester's tuition looked up simultaneously, conversations halting mid-sentence. Only one held her gaze, the man at the head of the table whose position of authority was unmistakable even in the round table arrangement. Dark hair, precisely styled, with a jawline that could cut glass, and eyes so intensely blue they seemed to pierce through her practiced professional smile, stripping away her defenses. "Good evening, gentlemen," she managed, her voice steadier than her hands, which she kept clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. "I'm Aria, and I'll be your server tonight. May I start you with some drinks while you consider the menu?" As she moved around the table taking orders, she felt the headman's gaze following her every movement, assessing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. When she reached him last, he didn't immediately respond to her question about his drink preference, instead, studying her face as if committing it to memory. "You're new," he stated instead, his voice deep and smooth with just the faintest hint of an accent that she couldn't quite place. Not a question. An observation that somehow made her feel completely exposed, as though her 3 months at Valentino's was information he should already know. Later, as Aria returned with the drink tray balanced carefully in her hands, her phone vibrated insistently in her apron pocket, the pattern of 3 short buzzes indicating the special ringtone she'd set. She never took personal calls during shifts, but with her grandmother in hospice care back in Sicily, she kept the phone with her constantly, a connection to the only family she had left. After placing the last drink, a 25-year-old scotch that probably cost more than her monthly rent, she stepped back against the wall and discreetly checked the screen while the men resumed their intense discussion. It was her grandmother's nurse calling from the small village outside Palermo, the call she'd been dreading for weeks. "Pronto," she whispered, the Sicilian slipping out automatically, as it always did when speaking to anyone from home. Her body turned slightly away from the table in a futile attempt at privacy. The nurse's voice came through, soft and regretful, speaking rapidly about deteriorating conditions and final arrangements that needed to be made. When she ended the call and looked up, blinking back tears that threatened to spill over, the entire table had fallen silent, as if someone had pressed a mute button. 6 pairs of eyes watched her with expressions ranging from annoyance to curiosity, but only the headman's gaze had changed. Sharper, more focused, his head tilted slightly as if seeing her for the first time, instead of just another server in black and white. "Mi dispiace, Signor Castellini," she murmured unconsciously in perfect Sicilian dialect, using his family name that she'd overheard earlier in hushed, reverent tones from the kitchen staff. The moment the words left her lips, his expression transformed completely, recognition and something like shock flickering across his features. He froze, scotch glass halfway to his mouth, eyes widening almost imperceptibly in a face otherwise schooled to reveal nothing. For several heartbeats, no one at the table moved or spoke, the tension suddenly thick enough to cut with a knife as the other men glanced between them with growing unease. Then he set down his glass with deliberate care and said something in rapid Italian to the man beside him, his voice too low for Aria to catch despite her fluency. The subordinate immediately stood and moved to the door, positioning himself there like a sentry, hand casually reaching inside his jacket in a gesture that sent ice through her veins. "Gentlemen, excuse us for a moment," Castellini said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of authority that allowed no argument, not even from the older, heavy-set man who looked like he wanted to protest. "Family matter to attend to. We'll resume our discussion shortly." The others nodded, and resumed their conversation as Castellini stood and gestured for Arya to follow him into a small antechamber off the main private dining room. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she obeyed, the weight of his stare and the unexpected recognition in his eyes making her wonder if she'd made a fatal mistake. "How do you know that name?" he asked once the door closed behind them, his voice low but intense as he positioned himself between her and the only exit. "And how do you speak that particular Sicilian dialect? One from a very specific village in the mountains that most Italians couldn't even locate on a map." Arya's mouth went dry as she clutched her serving tray against her chest like a shield. "My grandmother raised me in Castellammare del Golfo until I was 12. She taught me the dialect before English or Standard Italian," she answered honestly, seeing no point in lying to a man who clearly knew more than he should. His eyes narrowed, studying her with renewed interest that felt like being dissected. "Your grandmother's name?" he demanded, taking a step closer that forced her back against the rich mahogany paneling of the wall. "Francesca Cardellini," she whispered, watching as recognition flashed across his face, followed immediately by something that looked almost like wonder. "She moved to America with me after my parents died in the ferry accident off Palermo." For several tense seconds he said nothing, just stared at her as if recalculating everything he thought he knew. "The nurse you just spoke to. Your grandmother is dying," he stated rather than asked, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Yes, I've been saving for a ticket home, but between tuition and rent," Arya stopped herself, realizing she was rambling to a dangerous man who had no interest in her financial struggles. "I'm sorry for the interruption. I'll return to my duties." He blocked her path with a raised hand that never actually touched her. "Your full name," he commanded, pulling his phone from an inner pocket of his perfectly tailored suit jacket. "Arya Cardellini," she answered, watching in confusion as he typed something rapid into his phone before returning his full attention to her. "Is there a problem with my service, Mr. Castellini?" "No," he replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips without reaching his eyes. "And I'm not Mr. Castellini. That was my father. I'm Lucas Castellini." He studied her reaction closely, clearly expecting the name to mean something, but it held no significance beyond what Paolo had whispered frantically before her shift, that the owner of Valentino's would be dining tonight with associates who must not be disturbed or displeased in any way. The door opened without warning, and the man who'd been stationed outside stepped in, leaning close to whisper something in Lucas's ear that made his posture shift subtly. "Bring the car around," Lucas replied with a nod before turning back to Arya, with an expression that had hardened into pure business. "You'll finish your shift normally, then meet my driver at the staff exit at exactly midnight," he instructed, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request but a command. "Pack whatever you need for an extended trip. Your rent and other obligations will be handled." Arya backed away, her spine pressing harder against the wall. "I don't understand. Why would I go anywhere with you?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt, as alarm bells rang in her head. A flicker of impatience crossed his face before he reached into another pocket and extracted a slim leather wallet, from which he removed a faded photograph that he handed to her with careful precision. "Your grandmother wasn't just from my family's ancestral village. She was under our protection until she disappeared 17 years ago." The photograph showed a much younger version of her grandmother, standing beside a distinguished-looking older man with Lucas's eyes, both smiling at the camera in front of a stone building with a familiar family crest carved above the entrance. "That's my grandfather's house in Sicily," Arya whispered, looking up in confusion. "That is the original Castellini family home, and the man beside your grandmother is my father, who considered Francesca family," Lucas corrected, watching her face closely as the implications began to sink in. "The ferry accident that killed your parents wasn't an accident. It was meant for all of you." Arya's knees threatened to buckle as the room seemed to tilt around her. "That's not possible. My parents were professors, not criminals, or—" She stopped as Lucas shook his head slowly, taking the photograph back with gentle fingers. "Your father was my father's consigliere, his most trusted advisor and oldest friend," Lucas said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of history she couldn't begin to comprehend. "Your mother was American, brought in to establish legitimate business connections in New York, which is why your grandmother fled here with you. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but fragments of memories began to surface. Hushed late-night conversations her grandmother would abruptly end when she entered the room. The way they'd moved apartments 5 times in their first 2 years in America. The locked box under her grandmother's bed that she was never allowed to touch. The door opened again, this time revealing the heavy-set man from the dinner table, who frowned at the sight of them standing so close together. "We have business to finish, Lucas," he said in heavily accented English, his disapproving gaze sweeping over Arya as if she were something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of his expensive shoe. 3 weeks later, Arya stood before the full-length mirror in her new bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her in a midnight blue gown that cost more than a semester's tuition. The transformation from waitress to apparent Castellini family associate had happened with dizzying speed after that night at the restaurant. True to his word, Lucas had arranged for her to visit her grandmother in the private medical facility where she'd been mysteriously transferred the very next day. The reunion had been bittersweet, Francesca more lucid than she'd been in months thanks to new treatments, yet still slipping away despite the best care money could buy. "You look like your mother," came a deep voice from the doorway, where Lucas leaned against the frame in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that accentuated his broad shoulders and narrow waist. She caused quite a stir at her first gallery opening too, though for different reasons than you will tonight. Arya turned to face him, still not entirely comfortable with the strange arrangement that had brought her to live in his Manhattan penthouse, under the pretense of being his executive assistant. "I still don't understand why I need to attend this event. Surely there are more qualified people to help identify potential art acquisitions." A rare smile crossed his face as he entered the room, stopping at a respectful distance that he always maintained despite the rumors she knew circulated among his staff. "The D'Angelo family will be there tonight. They were once allies of both our families before they orchestrated the ferry bombing that killed your parents and my father on the same day." Her hand flew to the diamond pendant at her throat, another Castellini family heirloom Lucas had insisted she wear tonight, claiming it would send a message to certain people. "You're using me as bait," she realized aloud, watching as his expression shifted from appreciation to something darker. The gallery hummed with Manhattan's elite, champagne flowing freely as collectors and socialites moved between priceless artworks displayed with calculated precision. Arya stayed close to Lucas's side, acutely aware of the watchful eyes of his security detail positioned discreetly throughout the crowded space. "Don't look now, but Gianni D'Angelo just entered with his nephew, the one about your age," Lucas murmured against her ear, his hand warm and steady against the small of her back as he guided her toward a large abstract canvas. "They've spotted us, which means we have approximately 3 minutes before they approach." "What do I do?" Arya whispered, fighting the urge to turn and stare at the men who may have ordered her parents' deaths. "I don't know if I can face them without falling apart or causing a scene." Lucas's fingers pressed slightly firmer against her back, in silent reassurance. "You don't need to do anything but exist, wearing that pendant and standing beside me. It's already driving them crazy with speculation," he replied, his smile never faltering though his eyes had hardened to ice. When the D'Angelos finally approached, Gianni's face was a mask of polite interest, while his nephew stared openly at Arya with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Lucas, what an unexpected pleasure," Gianni said smoothly, extending his hand with practiced charm that couldn't quite disguise the calculation in his eyes. "Gianni," Lucas replied coolly, accepting the handshake with calculated brevity, while subtly positioning himself between Arya and the nephew, whose predatory gaze made her stomach turn. "I didn't realize you had returned from your extended stay in Milan, no doubt on urgent family business." The older man's eyes kept darting to the diamond pendant at Arya's throat, recognition and disbelief battling across his otherwise controlled features. "Indeed, though nothing as interesting as your new companion wearing Marcella Castellini's necklace, an heirloom I believed was buried with her 15 years ago. Allow me to introduce Arya Cardellini," Lucas said smoothly, emphasizing her surname in a way that sent visible shock through both D'Angelos. "She recently discovered her connection to our shared histories, and has been helping me evaluate some family acquisitions." The nephew stepped forward, extending his hand toward Arya with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Carlo D'Angelo, a pleasure to meet family connections from the old country," he said, his grip lingering uncomfortably as he raised her hand as if to kiss it. Before his lips could make contact, Arya withdrew her hand with practiced grace that belied her racing heart. "My grandmother spoke of the D'Angelo family's skill at creating beautiful facades," she said sweetly, repeating the line Lucas had carefully coached her to deliver, watching as Carlo's expression hardened. "Your grandmother must have quite the memory," Johnny interjected, his voice deceptively light, as his eyes narrowed with calculation. "I thought Francesca Cardellini had been declining for years. Dementia, wasn't it?" Ice flooded Aria's veins at this confirmation that they had been monitoring her grandmother all this time. "Memory is selective," she replied, grateful for Lucas's steady presence beside her, as the room seemed to tilt slightly beneath her feet. "Indeed it is," Lucas agreed, his hand returning to the small of Aria's back, in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. "Which reminds me, the Marconi auction next week includes several items from the Sicilian collection that might interest you, Johnny." The older man nodded tightly, recognizing the dismissal in Lucas's tone. "We should catch up properly soon. Family connections shouldn't be neglected," he said, his gaze lingering meaningfully on Aria before he turned to leave, Carlo reluctantly following after one last predatory glance. "We need to leave, now," Lucas murmured once they were out of earshot, guiding Aria swiftly toward a side exit where his security detail was already moving into position. "They recognized you, which means the plan is working, but it also puts you in immediate danger." The black sedan sped through Manhattan's streets, Lucas's face illuminated intermittently by passing streetlights as he spoke rapidly on his phone in Sicilian dialect. Aria sat beside him, still trembling slightly from the encounter, the reality of her new life crashing down on her with crushing weight. "They'll make a move tonight," Lucas said after ending the call, turning to face her fully in the dim interior of the car. "My contacts confirm Gianni already sent for reinforcements from their Brooklyn operations. They're mobilizing against us." Aria clutched the leather seat beneath her, the beautiful dress suddenly feeling like a costume in a play where she didn't know her lines. "I don't understand why they'd care about me after all this time. I'm nobody, just a college student who waited tables until 3 weeks ago." Lucas's expression softened slightly, a rarity she'd witnessed only when he visited her grandmother in the hospice facility. "You're the daughter of Franco Cardellini, who had evidence of the D'Angelo's betrayal hidden away before his death, evidence they believe died with him and your mother on that ferry." The realization struck her like physical blow. "And now they think I might have access to whatever evidence my father had," she whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place as she remembered the safety deposit box key her grandmother had pressed into her hand during their last visit. The car pulled into an underground garage beneath an unmarked building in the financial district, where 5 black SUVs waited with engines running. "This is where I need to ask something difficult of you," Lucas said, taking her hand in his with unexpected gentleness. Inside, Aria found herself in a wood-paneled conference room where 8 men of varying ages sat around an ornate table, their conversations halting abruptly as she entered with Lucas. "Gentlemen," Lucas addressed them, his voice carrying the authority of a man twice his 28 years, "may I present Francesca Cardellini's granddaughter." An elderly man at the far end of the table rose slowly to his feet, leaning heavily on an ornately carved cane as he studied Aria with eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "The resemblance to your mother is remarkable," he said, his Sicilian accent thick with emotion. "But you have Franco's spirit in your eyes." "Aria," Lucas said formally, "these are the heads of the 5 allied families who have protected what remains of the true Sicilian brotherhood in America. Men who stood with your grandfather and father against those who would corrupt our traditions and heritage." The elderly man approached slowly, each step deliberate as he came to stand before her. "I am Giuseppe Calabresi, your grandfather's oldest friend, and the keeper of the old oaths," he said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small, worn leather pouch. "The D'Angelos violated the sacred trust between our families when they aligned with the Russian Bratva 17 years ago," one of the younger men explained, his New York accent contrasting with the older men's Sicilian tones. "Your father discovered their betrayal and gathered evidence before they could move against us." Giuseppe opened the pouch and carefully emptied its contents into his palm. A small golden key, identical to the one her grandmother had given her. 2 keys, 2 parts of the evidence," he explained, his rheumy eyes watching her face carefully. "But only blood can open the Cardellini vault." Aria withdrew her grandmother's key from the silver locket she'd worn since their hospital visit, the weight of legacy hanging between them as the 2 keys caught the light. "My grandmother said this would unlock my future when I was ready to face my past," she explained, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The room fell silent as Giuseppe placed both keys side by side on the polished mahogany table, their identical designs confirming what the old man already knew. The evidence vault requires both keys turned simultaneously by blood relations, a safeguard your father designed knowing the DeAngelis would hunt anyone who possessed either key. Dawn was breaking over Manhattan when Aria finally returned to Lucas's penthouse, exhaustion pulling at her limbs as she stepped out of the elevator. The night had been a blur of revelations, ancient oaths, and plans forged in the shadow of generations of secrets she was only beginning to understand. "You should rest," Lucas said softly, his own fatigue evident in the shadows beneath his eyes as he followed her into the luxurious apartment that had never felt less like home. "Tomorrow will bring challenges we can't face exhausted." Arya paused by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city awaken below them like a living organism, oblivious to the power struggles that shaped its undercurrents. "My whole life has been a carefully constructed lie," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She turned to find Lucas watching her with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead felt like the only solid thing in her rapidly shifting reality. "Not everything was a lie," he said, closing the distance between them with measured steps. "Your grandmother loved you enough to sacrifice everything to keep you safe." The golden morning light caught in his dark hair as he stood before her, no longer the intimidating Mafia air, but simply a man carrying the weight of impossible responsibilities. "I've known about you since I was 15, he admitted quietly, the confession clearly costing him something precious. Arya's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing to process this new revelation. "You knew who I was at the restaurant that night, before I ever spoke Sicilian or mentioned my grandmother," she realized, studying his face for confirmation. A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he nodded slowly. "I'd been watching over you from a distance since my father's death. It was his final request to me," he explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But I needed you to discover the truth on your own terms." A distant memory surfaced in Arya's mind. A tall figure watching from across the street when she graduated high school. A glimpse of someone who looked remarkably like Lucas, disappearing into the crowd at her college orientation. "You were there all along," she whispered, the realization both comforting and unsettling as years of unexplained coincidences suddenly made sense. Lucas's shoulders tensed slightly, guilt flashing across his features before he mastered it. "I wanted to approach you countless times, especially after your grandmother's health began declining," he admitted, running a hand through his hair in a rare display of uncertainty. "But doing so would have exposed you to the very danger we're facing now." The gala was in full swing by the time they arrived the following evening. The Historical Society's annual fundraiser transformed into a glittering battlefield where family loyalties and betrayals played out beneath chandeliers and champagne toasts. Arya moved through the crowd on Lucas's arm, her burgundy gown concealing both the safety deposit box key and the small pistol Lucas had insisted she carry. "Gianni is by the east entrance with Carlo and 2 men I don't recognize," Lucas murmured against her ear, his breath warm against her skin as they maintained the charade of a couple deeply engrossed in each other. "Giuseppe's men have confirmed the documents are secure in the bank vault across the street. The plan was simple but dangerous. Draw the DeAngelos' attention while Giuseppe's grandson retrieved the evidence from the vault using the combined keys. The courier is in position," Lucas continued, his hand warm against the small of her back as he guided her toward the balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue. Carlo's approach was exactly as they'd predicted, separating from his uncle to intercept them near the balcony doors, his face a mask of practiced charm that couldn't disguise the menace in his eyes. "Ms. Cardellini, you look ravishing tonight. Perhaps you'd honor me with a dance while Lucas catches up with my uncle." Before Lucas could intervene, Arya stepped forward with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you privately," she said, watching surprise flicker across his face before it settled into smug satisfaction as he offered his arm to lead her onto the balcony. The night air was cool against her flushed skin as Carlo closed the balcony doors behind them, effectively cutting them off from the crowded ballroom. "I knew you'd recognize the advantages of our family's protection over the Castellinis," he said, moving closer with predatory intent that made her skin crawl. "I recognize something," Arya agreed, her fingers closing around the small pistol concealed in her dress pocket as she maintained eye contact with the man who'd helped orchestrate her parents' deaths. "I recognized the D'Angelo family crest on the detonator designs in my father's evidence files." Carlo's expression transformed from smugness to cold fury in an instant, his hand reaching inside his jacket, just as the distinctive crack of gunfire erupted from the street below. "You little," he began, lunging toward her with murderous intent. The bullet struck Carlo's shoulder before he could finish his sentence, the shot coming not from Aria's concealed weapon, but from Lucas's security positioned across the street. Carlo collapsed against the railing, blood blooming across his white shirt like crimson roses on fresh snow as sirens wailed in the distance. Lucas burst through the balcony doors, weapon drawn and eyes wild with a protective fury she'd never witnessed. "Giuseppe has the evidence secured. The D'Angelo empire falls tonight," he said, reaching for her with his free hand as security teams swarmed the ballroom behind him, federal agents emerging from their deep cover. 6 months later, Aria stood beside Lucas at her grandmother's peaceful graveside, her fingers intertwined with his, as Sicily's warm breeze carried the scent of lemon blossoms across the restored Cardellini estate. "She lived to see justice served," Lucas whispered against her hair, the weight of their shared legacy no longer a burden, but a foundation for something neither of them had dared hope for, a future where their family's blood sealed not vengeance, but redemption. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because your support is what keeps me creating these stories for you.